I'll now talk about the non-traditional alternatives in political theory. The name sounds a bit odd because we have been accustomed to hearing empirical political theory or modern political theory as something different from classical political theory. But I think by calling them either empirical or by calling it modern, we deny the rich body of traditional political theory of their share of empiricism or even their share of being modern. They are often modern in the sense we use the word modern. So for that, to avoid that, I label it differently and call them non-traditional political theories. The preeminence of traditional political theory, which started from 5th century, was carried on almost till the late 17th century, or even with Hobbes. This is Hobbes who first discussed politics from some kind of a mathematical point of view, from laws of motion, almost the first use of a scientific theory in the understanding of politics. Hobbes is also highly influenced by Euclidean geometry, which taught that everything has to be started from the first assumptions and it will proceed up to the last proof. With Hobbes, that is in 1650 or 1651, as middle of 17th century, started a movement which tried to bring in science more and more into political thinking, into political analysis. And by science, I don't mean, or we never mean, science or laboratory science, because laboratory science is not permitted in discussions on politics. Science means a particular methodology of acquiring facts, acquiring knowledge, using them for analysis and drawing inference from them, and also from the fact that science amasses knowledge which can be verified in a later stage at a later point of time. Science doesn't use unverifiable assumptions. In that sense, there started a movement since the days of Hobbes of slow incursion of scientific methodology in the understanding or explanation of political reality. And it came to a height, I would say, from the middle of 20th century. But in between, there came Marx about in the time of middle of 19th century. Now, when we differentiate, as is the usual practice, between traditional political theory and empirical or modern political theory as two sides or two polarities, we can't fit in Marx or Marxist political theory into either of them. Marx stands in between. But Marx is the first one who brought in to our understanding the linkage between society and politics with his ideas of historical materialism. If you remember, the last point we mentioned about the weaknesses of traditional theory was that traditional theory considered politics to be an entirely autonomous activity, divorced and delinked from the larger social reality. It was Marx who showed to us that politics is a part of social superstructure which rests on an economic base of any given society. And that economic base was constituted by two factors, two elements: the means of production, how things are produced, what things are produced, what are the modalities of producing, and also the relations of production, that is, social relations which grew out of economic relations. So it's a completely economic base on which rises the social superstructure, and politics is a part of the social superstructure. In that sense, understanding of politics depends first on understanding of the nature of the economic base. And it changes in the economic base, it changed. It changed. History has shown that it changes. That's part of the historical materialist point of view of Karl Marx. That it changed because people are forever engaged in controlling nature more and more for their own purpose. With that view in mind, with that objective in mind, people have devised ways and means of putting nature more and more to its use. And that's how production changed. That's how at some point of time we brought in machines. Till then we were working with our own hands, with our own physical labor. So the changes in the production system, there came changes in social relations. And together it changed the economic base. And with each change, there is a realignment of economy-based social relations, which in Marxist terminology is known as class relations. With change in class relations, with change in who is the ruling class, what ruling class is there now, there is change in the social superstructure, a part of which was politics. Now, as I was talking about the influx or incorporation of science into the ideas of politics, an understanding of politics, the first conscious attempt of bringing in scientific methodology in the study and understanding of politics, we could find with what is known as the beginning of behavioral revolution. Behavioral revolution started in USA. We can talk about that in 1925. Prior to that, in 1908, Graham Wallace wrote a book on the nature of politics. In 1925, Charles E. Merriam, he was president of the American Political Science Association, gave his presidential address in the 1925 conference of the American Political Science Association, and in which he hinted about the change in the line of thinking. So long, classical political thinking was either concerned with ideas or ideologies or concerned with institutions. Now, with time, both changes. With place, both changes. We cannot find the same institutions everywhere. In the world of 1925, the world was fast changing. In 1917, the first socialist state of Soviet Union has come into existence, presenting to us a totally different kind of political system, a totally different kind of politics, which was not the usual on the usual menu of Western political thinking. Around late 1920s, fascism started rearing its head in Germany and Italy, and by 1930s, Nazi Party has come to power in Germany. There is colonialism, there were anti-colonial movements in various colonies. So the world of politics was not the world which Plato, Aristotle, or much later even Hobbes and Locke found. So to cope with these changes, the reliance on ideas are fast changing. On institutions were crumbling, they're falling down, and new institutions coming place were found to be inadequate. And moreover, in the entire body of classical thinking, individuals are not there. Individuals who are the driving force of politics. Now, to cope with all these shortcomings or supposed weaknesses of the traditional body of thinking, the idea of concentrating on political behavior of individuals and of groups to understand politics of a particular political entity or a political system or a particular country was introduced by the behavioralists. Now, human behavior is something which is directly observable and something which allows systematic observation and systematic analysis. and something which can be verified by those who are coming later or other thinkers. Now, this insistence on observing, making human behavior to be the unit of analysis in politics was the basic objective of what later known as behavioral movement or behavioral revolution or behavioral approach or even behavioral theory in political science. Now, what was the basic objectives of behavioral theory? In a nutshell, Robert Dahl stated that behavioral theory aims at stating all the phenomena of government in terms of observed and observable behavior of men, a total departure from either ideas or institutions, and a total focusing on observed and observable behavior of men. And according to Dahl, its goal was to develop a science of politics modeled after the methodological assumptions of natural science. The most important, I should say, the high priest of behavioralism, David Easton, wrote in 1967 and pointed out about 8 characteristics of behavioral approach or behavioral theory. To mention them: regularities, verification, techniques, quantification, values, systematization, pure science, and integration. Taken together, they refer to a scientific attitude towards the understanding of politics, an attitude which produces a theory which is open for verification and is based on observable and observed behavior of men as individuals and men as groups. The most basic element of behavioral approach was perhaps its insistence on separating value from facts, that we should not be subjective either in collecting facts, in choosing facts to be highlighted, or in coming to a conclusion, both of which were criticisms leveled against the traditional way of thinking. And the behavioral movement emphasized rigorously one should be value-free, one should be rigorously value-free in one's research work. And that created a problem which led to the emergence of another movement called Post-behaviouralism, and it was also started by David Easton himself. It was not a negation of behavioralism, it was rather a continuation of behavioralism, which came to be known as post-behavioralism, in which both substance and techniques, both values and facts were allowed to exist side by side, and it is expected that political scientists will not just concentrate on value-free empirical research work, but will come down on the ground and assess and also give their ideas on what should be done to cope with the crisis which are facing the country and facing the world of that time. So that's in a nutshell the entire behavioral movement. Next to that, the next alternative is important, and I have mentioned previous section that Aristotle said that the men are naturally the commanders, they should command, and women was never there, nowhere there. So out of that fact that women, who constitutes the other half of the population, who hold up half the sky, were totally denied any place at all in the entire body of traditional political thinking. They are also denied their rightful existence in the actual political world too. So from 1840s, we found in the Western world movement of women for political rights. It continued till 1920s, when in most of the Western countries, women got the right to vote, to be counted as equal, at least in one respect, the political respect, with the men. And from this movement for women's political rights emerged a line of thinking which is known as the feminist political philosophy. The basic aim of feminist political philosophy, born out of the movement for equal political rights, was that The feminists wanted, first of all, to critique the existing body of theories for their lack of insistence on women, for the lack of giving any, for their unwillingness to give any space to women in their ideas, and also to show how to reconstruct both theory as well as practice of politics so that the women get their rightful place, women being the other half of the population. Now, with that in mind, there appeared ideas. One must focus on this point as well, that being so long denied of political rights, being so long denied of any place in the world of ideas, the women themselves were not also very sure about which path to take. There are differences among the women also. But all of them were wanting their rightful place. So from 1960s, we found what is known as scholasticism or academic work, so long as a movement for rights. From out of the movement came or emerged academic works on what is known as feminist philosophies or feminist political philosophies, something like that. The most important one is almost everyone knows the name, Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, which came out in 1970, or Robin Morgan's Sisterhood is Powerful. It also came out in 1970. Now, we got out of this a number of different ideas on feminism. It's called radical feminism, black feminism, socialist feminism, liberal feminism. So many feminisms are there. There are differences between them, but all of these different schools of feminist thought have something in common. That agreed on the point that both real world of politics and the academic world which deals with politics have denied them the real place, the place they deserved. It also supported, consciously or unconsciously, patriarchal submission of women to men, making them in the private worlds some kind of second-class citizens. So all of them want a reconstruction, both in the theoretical orientation as well as in actual political life. And finally, we'll mention one more school, the school of postmodernism. It's not very easy to discuss postmodernism. Now, of course, postmodernism is predicated on the word modern, and that itself is quite debatable, what is modern. But all the modern conceptions of which known as modern concepts are built on some which they call meta-narratives, some grandiose schemes, like if we can quote Woodrow Wilson in times of First World War, making the world safe for democracy. The objective of Soviet Communist Party, spreading communism throughout the world, or the narrative of the Nazi Party of Aryan racial supremacy. So they all dealt with big things, big issues: democracy, nationalism, communism, socialism throughout the world. But colonialism or anti-colonialism. But postmodernists would like to point out that these umbrella-like ideas obfuscate the fact that down below there can be various small groups fighting for their individual rights, their individual positions, fighting against the exploitations they are subjected to, fighting for their social identities which they have been denied for long. So the world is not should not be looked at from a macro point of view. That we should look from a micro point of view is composed of a number of groups, each having its own objectives, each fighting for its own cause. For example, they would like to point out that we label something as anti-colonial movements. Now, anti-colonial movements in colonies had different natures, different demands, different people participating in different countries. Now, Indian anti-colonial movement was not something to be found in any African country. So, in talking about larger issues, the uniqueness of the smaller fights, smaller struggles, smaller groups wanting their specific identities, wanting a satisfaction of their specific needs and aspirations, they get lost. Some kind of erasure took place. Some kind of leveling out took place. Now, postmodernism focuses on these micro groups, micro struggles, denying the fact that the world can be understood from macro point of view. They are more interested in micro politics and not on macro politics. Macro politics could be found in the traditional thinking. Macro politics could be found in the Marxist body of thinking. Macro view could be found in the behavioral thinking. But postmodernists are trying to argue that all of such thinkings, all of such schools of thought deny small groups and individuals their rightful place. So these are four leading non-traditional alternatives in the world of political theory: the Marxist theory, the behavioral, including the post-behavioral, the feminist, and the postmodernist. Now, there's also the question, which is very vital, the question that whether there is any political theory today. The question was also there whether there is any need for a political theory today in this 21st century, or late 20th century. We are not getting any more of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Machiavelli, nor Plato, Aristotle. Perhaps after Marx and Mill, John Stuart Mill, after Marx and John Stuart Mill, we haven't got any theorist worth the name in that sense, any theory worth the name. George H. Sabine, in his book History of Political Theories, points at some place that each political theory is a response to a political crisis of the time. So if we are not finding political theorists of the stature of the names I have just uttered, does it imply that the world is free of political crisis? Perhaps not. The world is quite beset with a number of political crises which may not be what we had previously. Can we deny that religious fundamentalism is a great political crisis? Can we deny terrorism born out of such fundamentalism constitutes a crisis? So the list can be carried on. So crises are there. Each age produces its own crisis. But to meet the crisis of the present age, we hardly get any theory or theorist who can compare or which can compare to what we had in the past. Why? One reason perhaps may be our total insistence in the name of science, our total insistence on facts, forgetting that it needs perception, it needs values, it needs subjective assessments as well. After all, politics deals with men, and men are not machines. Hobbes' social contract theory can sound very archaic today, but Hobbes was talking about his own time, of the crisis that was facing his own England of that time, and he came out with a solution. It may be meaningless now, may be irrelevant now, but that was quite relevant for his time. Where do we find such kind of political theory, which has perhaps led to the question that has there been a decline of political theory, or do we still need political theories, or can do away with them? We may, in this context, we may end our observation perhaps with a lamentation best expressed by poet T.S. Eliot. Eliot, in his most important, most memorable poems, The Rock, written in 1934. He writes, and I quote, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Perhaps we are so much bent on gathering information that we have stopped acquiring knowledge. And perhaps we have so much bent on being knowledgeable, we are stopped getting wiser or stopped acquiring wisdom. And that may perhaps explain the suggested or possible decline of political theory, which started its long journey from as early as 5th century BC.